Okay, let's go. I'm Mike Diggs, and this is me reading Wikipedia. What? All of it? Today's random Wikipedia article is not really random. It's about my favourite cartoonist, a character called David Low. Sir David Alexander Cecil Low, born 7th of April 1891, died 19th of September 1963, was a New Zealand political cartoonist and caricaturist who lived and worked in the United Kingdom for many years. Low was a self-taught cartoonist born in New Zealand. He worked in his native country before migrating to Sydney in 1911 and ultimately in London, where he made his career and earned fame for his Colonel Blimp depictions and his merciless satirising of the personalities and policies of German dictator Adolf Hitler, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, and other leaders of his times. Low was born and educated in New Zealand. His first work was published when he was only 11 years old. His professional career began at the Canterbury Times in 1910. The following year he moved to Australia and he worked for the Bulletin. His work attracted the attention of Henry Cadbury, the part owner of the Star, and Low moved to London in 1911, working for that paper until 1927, when he moved to the Evening Standard. There he produced his most famous works, chronicling the rise of fascism in the 1930s, the policy of appeasement and the conflict of World War II. His stinging depictions of Hitler and Mussolini led to his work being banned in Italy and Germany, and his name appearing in the Black Book, which is the bit that always fascinates me about David Low, in that he managed to appear in Hitler's Black Book, which was, I think we'll later find, was a book that outlined all of the people that were on an execution list or an imprisonment list, should the Nazis manage to invade Great Britain. David was the son of a chemist, David Brown Low, and Jane Caroline Flanagan. David Low was born in Dunedin on the 7th of April 1891 and attended primary school there. His father later moved to Christchurch, where Low briefly attended Christchurch Boys High School. However, following the death of his eldest brother, Low was taken out of school, as his parents believed that he had been weakened by overstudy. Definitely one of my problems. Low's first cartoon was published in 1902 when he was 11 years old, a 3-strip cartoon in the British comic Big Budget. Would love to see Big Budget, wouldn't you? Low began his career as a professional cartoonist with the Canterbury Times in 1910. In 1911, he moved to Sydney, Australia to join the Bulletin. During his employment at the Bulletin, Low became well known for a 1916 cartoon satirising Billy Hughes, then the Prime Minister of Australia, entitled The Imperial Conference. After that success, Low published many cartoons depicting Hughes' forceful and eccentric personality. Hughes was not impressed and apparently called Low a bastard to his face, which would definitely please me to have a politician do that to me. A collection of Low's cartoons of Hughes entitled The Billy Book, which he published in 1918, brought Low to the notice of Henry Cadbury, part owner of the London Star. In 1919, Cadbury offered Low a job at the Star, which Low promptly accepted. In England, Low worked initially at the London Star from 1919 to 1927. The London Star sympathised with his own moderately left-wing views. In 1927, though, he accepted an invitation from Max Aitken to join the conservative Evening Standard on the strict understanding that there would be no editorial influence with his output. I wonder how that went. Low produced numerous cartoons about the Austrian Civil War, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, the 1936 Summer Olympics, the Spanish Civil War, and other events of the interwar period. He also worked with Horace Thorogood to produce illustrated whimsical articles on the London scene under the byline Low and Terry. John Gunther called Low the greatest caricaturist in the world in 1937. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels told Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax that British political cartoons, particularly those of Low's, were damaging Anglo-German relations. In 1937, Low had produced an occasional strip about Hit and Muss, Hitler and Mussolini. But after Germany made their official complaints, he substituted a composite dictator called Musler. After the war, Lowe is said to have found his name in the Black Book, the list of those the Nazis planned to arrest in the aftermath of an invasion of Great Britain. His works are featured in many British history textbooks. On the 1st of September, the Germans invaded Poland from the west, and on the 17th of September, the Soviets invaded from the east. Lowe depicted these events in one of his most famous cartoons, Rendezvous, which I just opened for those that are listening to the podcast. If you're following along, then it's the picture on the right there, entitled Rendezvous. This was first published in the Evening Standard on the 20th of September 1939. It satirises the cynicism that lay at the heart of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, showing Hitler and Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin bowing politely across the dead body of Poland, but nevertheless greeting each other respectfully as the scum of the earth, I believe, and the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. The words are based on those supposedly used by Henry Morton Stanley at his meeting with David Livingstone in 1871, and the dictators are shown raising their hats to one another in greeting similar to the two explorers in all of the artistic reconstructions of that earlier meeting. It's always interesting how cartoonists use imagery from the past to help with the narrative of a cartoon. If you recreate, I've found, because I've recreated David Lowe's picture actually a number of times when I'm dealing with right-wing politicians like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and I use that image because it resonates with people, because it's one of David Lowe's famous images. But then it's interesting that David Lowe had used the imagery of the Stanley and Livingstone images to base his picture on, because it helps you to explain that these two people have been looking for each other, and you don't. And if you use that imagery, then you don't need to do so much work. It does some of the heavy lifting for you as an illustrator. The Harmony Boys of the 2nd of May 1940 depicts Hitler, Stalin, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, and Spanish dictator Francisco Franco harmonizing and singing and getting on quite well together. When this cartoon was published, the German invasion of the Soviet Union was still more than a year in the future. His satirical works met with much criticism in the British public eye. The British press called him a warmonger, and many citizens felt disdain for his depictions of appeasement. Lowe remained in the United Kingdom for the rest of his career. He left the Evening Standard in 1950. That same year, he moved to the Daily Herald, and he stayed there until 1953. Finally, Lowe moved to the Manchester Guardian and was there from 1953 onwards. Lowe received a knighthood in the 1962 Birthday Honours List and died at his home in London on the 19th of September 1963. His obituary in The Guardian described him as the dominant cartoonist of the Western world. That's pretty much exactly the title that any cartoonist would die for, I think. Not literally. You wouldn't want to get that title and then die immediately. You'd kind of prefer it posthumously, as The Guardian did. There is a blue plaque that commemorates Lowe at 33 Melbury Court, Kensington. Lowe married Madeline Grieve Kenning of Auckland on the 7th of June 1920 in St Paul's Church, Covent Garden. They lived for many years in Golders Green, North London. The couple had 2 daughters. In 1939, Time described Lowe's breakfast as a political meeting with the cartoonist, his wife, and his 2 young daughters threshing out the news. His wife and daughters survived him. If you want to see some of Lowe's work, then the British Cartoon Archive at the University of Kent and the Political Cartoon Gallery on Lower Richmond Road in London have collections of his original works, and his work is also available in the National Library of Australia. I personally have a copy of his autobiography, and it's full of much of his work. And interestingly, this article doesn't really show the fact that he used to draw himself with his little dog as well, and carrying a bowler hat, as you can see in this image if you're watching the video. I have a great affinity with David Lowe, and I think my career, which will never be as successful as his, but it may mirror it slightly in that I started off in the UK, and eventually I'd love to go and live in New Zealand and just draw cartoons from there. But that's a little history of David Lowe, and I hope you enjoyed this. If you would like to leave some comments under this post, I'd really appreciate that because, and we might look at this as one of the things we read on Wikipedia. The commenting underneath a YouTube video or a Facebook post or even a podcast allows it to move up the algorithm. And we're all about algorithms, aren't we, these days? So maybe we should find out what algorithms are in the next Mike Reads Wikipedia.